T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence starts. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff.
It was 1976. At long last, the human species was finally on its way to Mars with 2 unmanned Viking spacecraft. The official goal of the eventual soft landing and of the scientific objectives to be carried out was the search for life on Mars. But the Viking mission, which was to resolve those fabled questions, is there life on Mars, has inspired only rancor and continued controversy for over 15 years, to this very day. Since 1983, science advisor Richard C. Hoagland has led a dedicated group of researchers in a broad-based scientific effort to try and figure out the set of enigmatic objects in a northern Martian desert called Cydonia, whose existence now astonishingly supports the former presence of intelligent life on the planet Mars. He and his colleagues are now working to decode the surprising mathematical message they discovered at Cydonia and to apply it to newly discovered but still baffling processes occurring in the solar system. This program, the NASA-Cydonia Briefings, is a summation of their results to date. It has been constantly updated at NASA's request before thousands of NASA scientists and engineers over the past 2 years. Now you will see the evidence for yourself. Richard C. Hoagland is a former journalist, science writer, and consultant to major news and research organizations, including the Cable News Network, Walter Cronkite, CBS News, New York's prestigious Hayden Planetarium, and the National Aeronautic and Space Administration. Hoagland is the well-known author of The Monuments of Mars, as well as many articles and research publications. Hoagland is known by many Americans as the co-creator in 1971 of mankind's first interstellar message, which was carried beyond our solar system on Pioneer 10. He currently serves as director of the nonprofit scientific and educational project for inner-city schools, the Enterprise Mission, and is science advisor to the International For the People radio network. In 1988, Mr. Hoagland was requested by NASA to make an initial presentation of the Cydonia research before several hundred engineers and scientists at the Goddard Space Flight Center outside Washington, D.C. In 1990, he was invited by the director of the Lewis Research Center, NASA's primary energy and power research facility in Cleveland, Ohio, to make a center-wide address to its several thousand engineers and scientists, where he dealt specifically with the surprising energy implications of the continuing Cydonia research.
This is Richard Hoagland. I'm pleased to be able to bring you the NASA-Cydonia Briefings. This report was not originally intended for public distribution. We are doing so now because of recent key developments regarding possible near-term application of this data to the field of energy, and we are responding to widespread popular requests. What you will hear is the complete unabridged presentation I made at the director's invitation to the NASA Lewis Research Center staff regarding our now successful decoding of Cydonia. On this tape, the graphics have been improved for clarity on television from the slides and overheads we used at Lewis, and we have included a special hard copy fold-out map of the Cydonia region to assist you. But before we begin, I want to show you some spectacular new computer graphics of the Cydonia region that were not available when I initially met with the NASA personnel. This remarkable 3D animation of the original NASA 2D Viking imagery was produced by one of our longtime colleagues in this research, Dr. Mark Carlotto of the Analytical Sciences Corporation in Reading, Massachusetts. Mark created this very accurate 3D rendition of Cydonia using a sophisticated shape-from-shading computer algorithm. This is the same technique that NASA used to create this flyover of Los Angeles from a two-dimensional Landsat photograph. Take a look at the three-dimensional detail that this technique provides of an area on Earth we know.
This is Los Angeles, California on July 3rd, 1985. We are now traveling toward the Pacific Ocean at about 200,000 miles an hour and will drop down behind Santa Catalina Island about 26 miles off the coast of Los Angeles. We're going to fly through the isthmus of the island and then cross the coast north of the Santa Monica Mountains. As we head south, we can see features such as Marina del Rey and Los Angeles International Airport. We see the Palos Verdes Peninsula in the center now, along with the Long Beach Harbor. Now, we're moving down into the Orange County area. The bow tie-shaped feature now visible are Balboa and Lido Islands in Newport Bay. We're heading toward Los Angeles, and in the center of the screen is downtown. We can see Mount Baldy at the top right of the screen, and as we pan the San Gabriel Mountains, we can note in the foreground the Santa Fe Dam and Recreation Area, the Santa Anita Racetrack and Golf Course.
Now, picture yourself flying only a few thousand feet above the Martian surface at Cydonia, courtesy of the most accurate photo representation of another planet currently available. Is this all just a trick of light and shadow? If you think that's something, stay tuned, because what we have decoded from these remarkable objects at Cydonia is literally being brought down to Earth by laboratory confirmation of a vast, previously unknown energy resource. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's begin as I began my briefing at the NASA Lewis Research Center. What I want to talk about is something that is intrinsically non-controversial, because for 30 years it has been an accepted paradigm that the human race is not alone, that there is someone else out there. The problem is when you begin to present specific information or specific data and say, this can be interpreted as evidence that we have found them. About 14 years ago, the unmanned Viking mission, whose stated objective was the search for life on Mars, went to Mars in the form of 2 orbiters and 2 landers. The landers carried out a number of experiments, soil samples, atmospheric analysis, and all that. Can we turn this down just a tad? We're getting a little bit of feedback. Thank you. Carried out those analyses, and the results were very ambiguous. We still do not know whether Mars is resident to microbial life. The Soviets seem to think that, in fact, there probably are places where there are microbes alive on Mars today. My seeking suspicion is that Carl Sagan agrees with them, as do many other people, but we don't know. What is intensely controversial, however, did not come from the surface lander experiments. It came from the orbital photographs, some 60,000 pictures that those spacecraft took in the extended mission. On a few of the frames taken shortly after orbital insertion. Orbital insertion for Viking Orbiter 1 was June 19th. On July 25th, that orbiter took a series of photographs of a northern desert region called Cydonia. And they came back through the communications channels to JPL, and Toby Owen, who was a mission scientist on the imaging team, happened to be putting them together, those photographs, as a mosaic, looking for landing sites for the second Viking lander, at that time about a few million miles out from Mars, heading in toward its own orbital insertion. And he noticed this mesa, this strange thing on the surface that leaped out because it looked, for all the world, like a humanoid face. Well, that was the beginning of the controversy. Where we have come in the 14 years since that photograph and that event took place is from an initial position where the reaction was it's a trick of light and shadow, to where it is by some small community of researchers outside of NASA investigated as a possibility in terms of its reality, to where now we have a spacecraft going back to Mars in 1992-93 with a camera capable of photographs 50 times sharper than Viking's. And according to Dr. Michael Mallon, who was the camera principal investigator, the Cydonia region and the face on Mars will be re-imaged. So the science has come the full circle of normal scientific development, from abject horror and shock that anything so outrageous could be real, to the simple, normal procedure of testing the hypothesis. Now, I've left out 14 years of very interesting stuff in between, which is what these photographs and a few other things are designed to fill you in on. So why don't we kill the lights and turn on the projector, and we shall begin. This, of course, is the Earth, the place where we are at the moment. For all of humankind, it has been viewed as the sole repository of intelligent life. But something in our hearts will not accept that. In our religions, in our philosophical writings, and now through our science, we continually quest to find out if, in fact, our aloneness is real. One of the things we have done is to create technologies that allow us now to turn the philosophical abstract discussion into something more concrete. We can listen. And there has grown up a paradigm in the last 30 years that if ET exists, ET out there will phone home, or at least phone NASA, and let us know. And there has become a great institutional momentum behind that concept. Unfortunately, what it has done is to take the field. It has become a kind of sole source idea. And the other idea, which for many, many years, decades, was alive and well in the culture, particularly at the turn of the century, namely the Lowellian, Bradbury, Burroughs concept that maybe there was someone alive right next door, has fallen into grave disrepute. Now, in major part, this is absolutely the way it should have been, because the science about this place, this is Mars, one of the better photographs taken, I believe, with a 60-inch on Mount Wilson, but don't hold me to that, has simply said that Mars, in the words of Elton John, is not the kind of place to raise your kids or anybody else's kids. It simply is inhospitable to human life as we know it, particularly human intelligent life. The probes of the early mid-60s, Mariner 4, Mariner 6 and 7, amply confirmed the beginning suspicions from ground-based astronomy that the atmosphere of CO2 and the partial pressures and the lack of water vapor conspired to produce a place that makes the Tibetan deserts look friendly and warm by comparison. Under those conditions, no one expected anything alive that you could talk to. And so the hopes for life on Mars retreated, albeit grudgingly, to the perspective where the only thing we would find would be a microbe, and of course you can't talk to very many microbes. So Viking was constructed, was conceived as a technology, yes, to look for life beyond the Earth, but the life that we expected to find was microbial, bacterial guys, and not the kind of guys that might be sending us radio messages across the night. However, As Carl Sagan said to the Presidential Space Commission at Stanford a couple, 3 years ago, Mars has surprises. And in the Viking database, one of those surprises, after this stunning set of photographs, one of those surprises was this. Because on that July morning, when Toby Owens saw this picture, there, staring back at him, was this strange visage. Now, the normal response, which was his and many, many others, was immediately, well, it's an interesting little trick of lighting. Let's move on. That was the normal response. However, when you apply a modicum of computer image processing, which NASA at that time did not do, planetary science community touched not this subject, that fell to two gentlemen named Pietro Molinar, who were imaging experts at the Goddard Space Flight Center, working under a subcontract to Lockheed to work on Landsat imagery. This funny kind of blobby thing turned out to have rather interesting beginning symmetry and proportion. Now, subsequent work, which has been part of the efforts that I have been privileged to lead at places like SRI and the University of California, Berkeley, and the Analytical Sciences Corporation in Reading, Mass., and others, has resulted in further improvements on the data. Now you begin to see that this guy not only has symmetry, but there are details, such as teeth in the mouth, the suggestions of true symmetry, bilateral symmetry, which of course facial constructs, natural wind-eroded mountains here on Earth like the Great Stone Face in New Hampshire, simply do not have. They are profiles, and this object is a frontal view. Well, the big question, of course, in everyone's mind who brushed up against this in the late 70s, early 80s, when DiPietro and Molinar were doing their work and being resoundingly ignored by certain people in the planetary science community, was, is there any other data? If we only had this shot, no matter what the tricks of algorithms could do to bring out what was there, you would literally never know and never be able to resolve the question, and I probably would not be standing here this afternoon. Fortunately, DiPietro and Molinar did what any good science should do in this situation. They went looking for corroborating data. They scanned through the entire Viking database, tens of thousands of frames, and found that, in fact, contrary to Jerry Soffin's statement that there was no image of a face when Viking re-imaged this area a few hours later, that the thing had gone away, they found that there existed a frame taken not a few hours later, but 35 days later, on not orbit 35, but orbit number 70. And that photo, when you blow up to the same scale, the face at a higher sun angle, some 20 degrees higher, this is what you see. This is now the high sun angle view, and the right-hand side, which had been missing in shadow, turns out to be there, albeit it's a little worse for wear. There is one rather interesting asymmetry, but in fact there are two eye sockets, the mouth goes through, and the so-called hairline goes around. Well, this was data that one could actually begin to do something with. For instance, this bench, to use a geological term, matches this bench in terms of a central symmetry axis. It is exactly as far away as this edge from the natural symmetry axis of the object itself. That was the beginning of the suspicion that maybe, just maybe, this was not just your average run-of-the-mill trick of light and shadow. This now is a computer-enhanced high sun angle frame done with a very subtle algorithm by Dr. Mark Carlotto at Analytic Sciences in Reading, which I believe also was part of his paper that he eventually published on the subject in the May issue of 88 Journal of Applied Optics. And what you see here very clearly is that whatever this object is, it is much more intriguing than a trick of lighting. It has symmetry, it has proportion, and it looks eerily suggestive. That is where the case lay until about 83, when DiPietro and Molinar chanced, through some machinations that are described in my book, so I won't go into them now, to give me a set of their pictures, their prints. One of the things that they had not done was to ask what I thought was a very important anthropological question, which is simply, if this was real, who in the world would have done it and why? So what we did was to set up a series of investigations, beginning with the independent Mars investigation team and moving on to the others. And we brought in what I felt needed to be brought in to solve that kind of problem. Namely, if it's real, if somebody did this, then there was a purpose, there was a goal, and an appropriately crafted investigation, including experts in a range of disciplines, might be able to approach serious, rational solutions to those questions. Namely, is it real, and what was its purpose? And one of the experts that we brought in, named Jim Shannon, who was a background in anthropology and art, did this analysis, which is a basic analysis of the object lying on this mesa, a mile long, and we now know 1,500 feet high. And he found some remarkable symmetries and proportions and elegances in terms of its placement that, to his qualitative trained eye, he felt were pushing chance that this in fact was not chance, that maybe in fact there was intention. This now is a more sophisticated kind of analysis. This is the three-dimensional wireform diagrams of Dr. Mark Carlotta's three-dimensional analysis, namely a shape from shading technique, which is single photo stereo. It's called photoplanimetry in some circles, and it has allowed us to recreate in 3 dimensions this structure. This is raw data from Viking, low sun angle, 10-degree sun, this photo, high sun angle, 30-degree sun, this photo, and the matching computer reconstruct lit in the computer at the same lighting based on the 3-dimensional reconstruction of the underlying topography. And what's interesting to note is that even subtle features, although the resolution is degraded because of the transform steps somewhat, even subtle features of the original data are reproduced in the reconstruction, giving one confidence that in fact we do have a handle now on the 3-dimensional underlying topography. Mark also was able to project the low sun angle frame onto its wireform diagram and then rotate in the computer the result so that we can in essence fly around in a helicopter, although you can't have a helicopter on Mars, this object at a reasonable altitude to try to gain a view in terms of its perspective from multiple azimuth directions. And it demonstrates one important thing, and that is that not only is the object bilaterally symmetric in 2 dimensions, but also in 3. Look at the so-called chin. Look at where it peaks and where the flat part of the headdress or whatever it is and the eyebrow ridge peak right down the axis of symmetry. So we're dealing with a symmetry not just in 2 dimensions, but in 3. Now these are all analyses that were brought to this data not inside the planetary science community, but outside. And I must say at some cost and sacrifice by investigators who were not funded and did this on their own time and after hours, and it seems to be continuing, midnight. Point is that the problem was non-trivial. The stakes, if we in fact have stumbled across extraterrestrial artifacts right next door, accessible to our technology, accessible to men and women going there someday, those implications are off scale. The amount of resources applied to this problem have been absolutely minuscule, almost non-existent by any normal science standard today. There is a disparity there, and it is a disparity which hopefully is now in the process of being corrected, not the least of which will happen when those new images come in, and those of us who need to see the hieroglyphs, if such things exist, will see some pretty stunning things if the model is confirmed. This is the context of what we're talking about. This is the Cydonia region. Now, there have been efforts to dismiss the whole idea of looking seriously at the data simply because in this northern desert region you can see a lot of terrain that looks kind of similar and knobby. And in fact, Carl Sagan has said, well, what are the chances that one random little mesa on Mars might suggestively look like a humanoid face out of tens of thousands of similar mesas, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That is the key question in my mind when I got involved in '83, because as part of that anthropological reasoning, it seemed to me that if this was real, if someone had done this, then there might be other things nearby that would be discoverable on the same Viking frames. And it was with that idea in mind that I began to look in the immediate vicinity of this space. This is now a processed shot in the computer, orthographically rectified by us as part of our subsequent work. And here's the face. If it does have an axis of symmetry, then at right angles to it, I reason, one might find something interesting if one of the purposes of this construct, if it was a construct, was to be viewed not from space or from high altitude, but perhaps from the ground. So I hypothetically put myself on the surface, and I looked here, and I looked here, and I noticed immediately that there were an interesting series of other rather important and unique morphologies, forms, that were located in just about the right position to get a very nice view of this thing as a profile. Well, that was essentially the breakthrough that led in subsequent years to a series of discoveries and mathematical confirmations that have taken us now almost light years beyond the initial naive questions, is it real or is it Memorex? This is a set of maps, set of relationships that I discovered that connect this set of objects, which we term the city or the collection of pyramids, with the face, with another object over on the ejecta blanket of this ancient crater, with a rather interesting circular formation we call the tholus, and then with this structure, which is perhaps the most interesting single object, the face notwithstanding, that we have found. A five-sided pyramidal structure that we call the D&M, because it was actually Di Pietro Molinar who found it on the second set of frames taken of Cydonia, and we thought that they should be remembered for having done that important beyond the envelope kind of looking, which in fact has brought us to where we are now. Okay, these are the objects labeled. This is the set of maps, and what I'm going to do is to take each of these objects in turn and describe to you why it's interesting and how we now think it relates to the overall context of the complex. This is the so-called pyramidal complex. This is the so-called city. One of the things I noticed was that in the center, and it turned out to be the exact lateral center defined by this edge and by this edge, all right, there was a collection of four little guys located exactly at 90 degrees to the axis of symmetry of the so-called face. They too were orthogonally, that is at right angles, arrayed. If we look in close-up, we can see them here. There's a fifth one located in the center. Now, some geologists would look at that and say, you're looking at an eroded crater. The problem is, there are problems with that analysis. For instance, crater slumping gives you radial structures, not structures that are arrayed at right angles and arrayed at, two on the opposite sides are at right angles to the radial line of two at right angles to those. So as we began to look at the details, it became more and more apparent that simple answers, simple geological answers, were not sufficient to resolve many, many interesting anomalies and paradoxes about this very tiny piece of real estate. This exemplifies what I'm talking about, the orthogonal relationships of these. All right, if we look really close, all right, you can see that if we had resolution 50 times sharper from Mars Observer, there is little doubt that we would be in a very different level of discussion than we are right now. But we will have to be patient. Fortunately now we are going to get that imagery, so it is only a matter of being patient and nothing more. This is what I discovered that began to really intrigue the heck out of me, because if you stand in that point and look across the face, the first thing I noticed was that the upper sight line and the lower sight line, defined as across the eyes and by the so-called chin, bounded and interesting formation located on the rim of this crater, but arrayed at 90 degrees to that sight line. That object, this is a little better close-up, all right. That object really intrigued me because it looked as if it did not belong in its geological context. If you go back one, which we can, you'll see that this is your conventional splash pattern crater. The theory is that in a primordial condition on Mars, circa 2-3 billion years ago, impact of an asteroidal meteoritic type object, and a waterlogged surface is splashed out and then refreezes to form this characteristic two-lobe splash pattern array. Problem is, this structure is at 90 degrees to the flow. If it had been there when the impact occurred, the splash should have flowed over it, in which case it would be obscured, or it would have dammed it up, in which case there should not be this lobe extending beyond it, which leads to our reasoning that in fact it has to be younger than the crater and not connected at all with its formation. Well, this kind of reasoning, trying to bring the plausible geology together with the implausible morphologies that we were finding, and the fact that it seemed to know, in terms of its optical width, to be as wide as two very key points on the so-called face from one point on the landscape, led to the very close examination of the object itself. It turns out to have a very straight top, at least 3 levels. There's an excavated area behind it whose volume is roughly equivalent, as near as we can tell, to the amount of material here, leading to the not implausible idea that maybe something was excavated and piled up to make it. Again, in the model that, in fact, any of this was made, and that, in turn, is a testable model, as you shall see. This is now the best enhancement that Carlotto has been able to do, and you can see that this object not only is intrinsically interesting, it is unique. There is nothing else like it on several hundred photographs that we've examined scattered around Mars of similar so-called rampart craters. It stands all by itself, except it doesn't. It stands on the rim, and it is the exact optical width of the face in terms of 2 key positions, and it seems to have a relationship with another very unusual object. So that was the beginning of our entry into this, which is there were some improbabilities, compounding improbabilities, all nestled in this one tiny piece of real estate on Mars, which made the piece of real estate become increasingly intriguing. Okay, back to the map. So we looked at the cliff. The next object that I want to look at is the city, is the face as seen from the city, all right? Because here's the cliff in the background. Here is the face as constructed by one of our artists in Berkeley, Cynthia Lynn, a painstaking clay model created from the 2 sets of imagery, high and low sun, and then lit with the simulated Martian dawn that one would see on the current environment of Mars, namely the red scattered dust, generating all kinds of interesting optical effects. My hypothesis that this was intentional was further amplified by the realization that the entire alignment of this complex was northeast-southwest. And in fact, if you look at the later recreation of the face in the computer, this is Mark Carlotto's 3-dimensional shape from shading technique, you'll find that there is a stunning correlation between Cynthia's work some years ago and Mark's work of about a year ago in terms of individual features, the relative heights, the view. This thing looks like a face even if you stand on the surface, as shown to us by 2 totally different techniques. Which brings me back to the solstice sunrise, all right? If you stand here and look across that sight line, at this as a profile, across the cliff beyond, it turned out that the last time you could have seen a sunrise that was the specific solstice sunrise was about 500,000 years ago, which brings us back to what this character looks like. Because qualitatively, and we have tested this now on all kinds of unsuspecting people that we have nabbed in the middle of the night and shown them the photograph and said, what does this look like? And they say it looks like a monkey face. Now that's interesting, because if we were dealing with a human psychological projection, you'd more reasonably expect maybe Marilyn Monroe or Paul Newman, but a monkey face? In fact,
we believe, based on more quantitative measures, that what we're looking at is a pretty good match to Homo erectus, which was a primitive anthropoid hominid, our own lineal ancestor in the fossil record, circa 500,000 to 1.5 million years ago. And the time frames, if our dating is anywhere near accurate in terms of the solstice business, fits. One overlaps the other. Is this conclusive? No. But it certainly impels one, I would think, to ask some more questions. Let's go the other way here. Okay, next object was this. Now, if we go back, all right, here, 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 now we're down here. The map says, because now we've discovered this, that this angle is about 81 degrees, and that leads us along that razor-sharp top edge on the cliff down to this structure, which we found really provocative because as we have moved through its analysis, we have found that it has both intrinsic interest both on Mars and also for what it portends for similar objects that we have just recently recognized on Earth. When I say recently recognized, I'll explain that in a moment. There is a model over here which we have brought that was done for us for the project by Mr. Tom Newberg, who works at the Richard Rush Studio in Chicago. The Rush Studio does exhibit-level models for a variety of science institutions and planetaria and museums all over the country. This object has very interesting multiple levels, and it looks slightly familiar. It turns out that it is a very good analog to objects that we have seen in ancient Britain. One in particular, Silbury Hill. Another one, the Old Sarum Earthworks. The proportions and the scale, this thing is about 2 miles across, all right? But the one in Britain is the largest man-made earth-filled structure anywhere in the world. Moving on. This is the enhancement of the object. There's 2 little mounds to the north of it that are separated from the top object that we've discerned now on the apex by 60 degree angles. What's important is that if you go from the cliff to the Tholus and then over to this object, that angle is exactly 90 degrees, and that leads us, of course, to consider what this object might be. This was the pyramid discovered by DiPietro and Molinari, and it is really important in that as you begin to look at various contrast enhancements, you discover that, in fact, it is a 5-sided object on a planet where 5-sided objects cannot form. Errol Torin of Defense Mapping, who was supposed to be here this afternoon and present this part of this discussion, and unfortunately had some problems arise in Washington and was unable to join us, has done some very stunning work in the discovery that not only is this structure 5-sided, but that geomorphologically, as you walk through the various possible formation mechanisms, things like mass wasting and wind faceting and sedimentation and all that, he has been able to systematically eliminate every plausible natural mechanism to create a bilaterally symmetric 5-sided object of the proportions and height of this object. There is nothing like this anywhere, not only on Mars, but also on Earth, on any other object or planet that we have looked at in terms of solar lithospheres, things like Triton or the moons of Jupiter or the moons of Saturn. It has 2 long sides and 3 short sides, and what Torin discovered was that this front angle connecting the short sides was precisely 120 degrees. That led him off into a series of calculations and measurements which resulted into in his own words, the stunning discovery that this object is in fact a coded mathematical Rosetta Stone. It appears to contain, in terms of its internal symmetries and angles, a set of proportions such that if you divide the angles into each other, you get a set of fundamental constants, square root of 2, square root of 3, pi, and e. If you look at the trig functions, you also get the same sets of constants, and if you look at the radian measure, you also get the same sets of constants. It was at this point that we realized that we now had what Arthur Eddington called the beginnings of a science. Arthur Eddington, who was the confirmer, I should say, of Einstein's general theory, said at one point to a Victorian audience, gentlemen, it was a Victorian audience after all, gentlemen, he says, you do not have a science unless you can express it in numbers. Well, with Torring's discovery and decoding of the interior geometry of the D&M pyramid, the hypothesis of an intelligent civilization on Mars went from a nice idea to a serious scientific, numerical, quantitative science of numbers. And it has led us in some very important directions. Because immediately after Errol did this work, which of course we've coded now in the form of several different representations, you can see that we've coded the angles. If you relate to the angles in terms of this table, you can find how we derive the constants, and you can see how we measure them. We're measuring here to about 2/10 of a degree in terms of accuracy, plus or minus. We're dealing with, we think, about 3 significant figures, and I'll tell you in a minute how we got to that level of precision. Most important, we're dealing with overwhelming redundancy, because we're finding the numbers and the constants not once, not twice, but up to half a dozen times. And I'll show you how we do that in a minute. What we have done for the benefit of those who would like to have time to peruse this new data quietly, we prepared an abstract with some of the photos and diagrams, and we're going to present to, 200 first come first servers, those abstracts that we've been able to Xerox up this afternoon, and we will add your name to a longer list, and Joyce Bergstrom will be making additional copies, and we'll give them to anyone who's interested, so you can actually see how we've arrived at this important new level of information and knowledge in the ongoing inquiry. But I cannot underrate and underestimate the importance of Errol Torring's achievement in solving what I think is a major breakthrough point in the whole 14 years of this controversy. Because from that, we were able to discover that, I was able to discover, that if you then measure the angles connecting the key objects we've just gone through, the city square, the eyes and chin of the face, the top and bottom of the cliff, the apex of the tholus, and the apex of the D&M, you find, if you just follow the color codes, you find the same angles repeated again and again and again, the same relationships, the same trig functions, the same radian measure, the same redundancy, and we think the same message. Messages are defined as signals in the noise. How do you differentiate a signal from a noise? I mean, you guys now are getting into communications, I understand, and signals are easy. Signals are redundant. Signals add, and noise cancels. What we seem to have found is a signal in the noise lying at a place that one never would have expected, namely a northern desert of the planet Mars. We think the signal has a purpose. We think this geometric set of relationships, redundantly encoded, were not done because they had nothing better to do, but were done because they may have been trying to tell us something. I now say they, and you'll probably detect that I say they rather confidently. The reason I do that is because nothing we find from Mars Observer can take back this geometry. We can't unlearn what we have found. Something has placed these objects in a configuration which is overwhelmingly redundant and confirmable by anybody who measures the photographs or goes back to the data tapes. And we believe that if anybody does that, they will retrace our steps and will find what we have found. The question before the House now is not, is it there, but in our level of understanding is, what does it mean? What we think it means, and again, this is due in large part to Errol's insight, what we think it means is that they were trying to tell us about tetrahedral geometry. Now, what do I mean by that?
I wanted to break in here before my NASA Lewis presentation moves into this critical new area to properly set up the leap that's just ahead. A tetrahedron, which is where the term tetrahedral geometry comes from, is a four-sided, four-cornered pyramid, the simplest regular solid that can exist, surrounded by a sphere. If you place a tetrahedron in a rotating sphere so that one corner or point of the pyramid sits at either the north or south polar rotational axis, the other three corners of that tetrahedron must lie at either 19.5 degrees north or south latitude relative to the sphere's equator, equally spaced at 120 degree intervals around the full 360 degree sphere. The crucial thing to remember, the basic geometry that determines this, the geometry of a tetrahedron in a sphere, is a fundamental constant of nature, no matter where in the solar system or in the universe you find it, or regardless of what kind of sphere fits around this hypothetical tetrahedron, including an actual spinning planet. What we found at Cydonia, what I'm about to describe to the NASA Lewis audience, is our astonishing step-by-step discovery that the fundamental layout of the entire Cydonia complex seems to have been deliberately planned, like some gigantic planetary treasure map, to lead us step by step with major clues like the discovery of pi and e, two fundamental mathematical constants, and then through this specific tetrahedron in a sphere geometry and millions of miles off Mars to the discovery of a fundamental new energy process occurring in other planets. This is an exact fit with the precise geometry of a tetrahedron in a sphere Cydonia prediction all over the solar system. Let's go back then and pick up the NASA Lewis presentation right where we left off.
If you go back and you look at some of the constants which are found in the DNM, and you can read some of them here, e divided by the square root of 5, square root of 5 divided by pi, e divided by pi, which is the most interesting one, frankly, you find a couple of other intriguing coincidences. You find that the actual geodetic latitude of the Cydonia site, if you go to Mert Davies at RAND, who does the control points for all of the space imagery over the last 30 years, if you go to him and you ask, like I did, find me the coordinates of Cydonia in the best inertial frame that we currently have, you will discover that the geodetic latitude that runs through the apex of this five-sided pyramid is equal to 40.87 degrees, and the tangent of that is equal to e divided by pi. E divided by pi as a ratio is also expressed several times within this structure and within the relationships between this structure and all the others in the complex. So we focused on e divided by pi. What could that, if it was intentional, what could that be trying to tell us? And we discovered a very interesting coincidence. E, of course, is 2.718282 carried out to a few places. And it is the base of natural logarithms. Pi, everyone's familiar with what pi is, circumference of a circle to its diameter in terms of a ratio. But why would anyone want to memorialize that relationship? Well, there is an equation discovered by Euler, I think, in the 1700s that embodies this, but it's the only one that I know of, and it may be significant and it may not. I'm not a mathematician, so I can't say. But what we did discover was that there's another relationship which is eerily interesting. And that is that if you take a tetrahedron, you know, the first Platonic solid, and you put it in a circumsphere, namely a sphere that will neatly englobe it so that all the points touch, and you measure the surface area of the tetrahedron, and you compare it to the surface area of the sphere, you arrive at a ratio of 2.72. You arrive at E. Now that is 2.7269, I believe, or something, or no, it's 2.72169, something like that. Real E is 2.7182. If you then divide each of these two numbers by pi, you get a ratio, 0.865 and 0.866, that differs by 1 part in 1,000. We have discovered both of these ratios memorialized in the Cydonia complex. We looked at the latitude of the two main features of the DNM. The apex of the DNM, which lies at the latitude of 40.87, and then a latitude that runs through that little bright knob on the front wedge, all right, and touches this left-hand buttress of the 5, which are, there's been some damage over here, so we're looking at 1 here, 2, 3, 4, 5. That latitude line, all right? And what we found is that these two latitudes, if you look at the tangent of this, it's equal to E divided by pi, and if you look at the latitude of this, it's equal to synthetic E, or the tetrahedral ratio E divided by pi. In other words, this object memorializes these two separate ratios. And what are the odds that that will happen just by chance? When we look at what we really are dealing with, which is the tetrahedron in the sphere, we began to ask ourselves, is it possible that they were trying to point us at the idea of tetrahedral geometry in a circumscribing sphere? And if that's true, what would that mean? What was significant about that? And then Errol noted that if you put the point of a tetrahedron in the Earth, imagine the Earth as a crystal globe, put the point on the North Pole, the other three vertices will come down below the equator to about 19.5 degrees south latitude. If you reverse it and put the point on the south rotational axis, the other three vertices will be at 19.5 north. And he then noted that there were several important ancient ceremonial complexes, starting with Teotihuacan, just north of Mexico City, that are precisely at that latitude. Because we then went back to the complex and we looked and we found that in fact in a specific geometric relationship between the cliff, the tholus, and an object that we hadn't really paid much attention to previously, which is a tetrahedral pyramid perched on the rim of this crater, the exact angular relationship between this, and this is 19.5 degrees. And that translated, in turn, on the other side of the complex into internal geometries defining 19.5 degrees in terms of the latitude line and the front 120-degree line connecting the apex with the two front edges or buttresses, and so on and so on. In other words, redundancy. A signal has to be redundant. Well, at this point, we became pretty convinced that somebody had wanted very clearly to communicate the importance of circumscribed tetrahedral geometry. On Mars, the Tharsis bulge, and specifically Olympus Mons, sit just about within a tenth of a degree, or not a tenth of a degree, well, yeah, about a tenth of a degree, south of 19.5. On Earth, Hawaii. But we quickly realized, if I can roll the film, for many years, the unusual dimensions of Mars, particularly this object and these three volcanoes, has puzzled the geographers and the planetologist types because it is orthographically unsupported. In other words, this thing bulges out and is not hydrostatically sitting on anything down below. It has deformed the overall figure of Mars to a significant extent. And there have been many, many models to try to explain how that in fact can happen. We now think we can explain the Tharsis bulge. We think that as a side effect of decoding the mathematics of Cydonia, we now understand why Mars is lopsided, why it is not or was not in hydrostatic equilibrium. In fact, why this whole hemisphere bulges out somewhat over a perfect spherical figure. In other words, we think we have discovered an insight as a side effect to our efforts to verify the reality of Cydonia, because the mathematics are telling us something profound and important, we now believe, about the way planets work. This is the kind, by the way, of three-dimensional imagery and computer reconstruction that we are hoping to be able to apply to the Cydonia data. It looks neat, and it would be very helpful in determining the fine points of some of the geometry. But John, we don't have the money, but we need a cray, and we understand you have one, and if you could see your way clear, we can talk later. Can we talk, is what your name says? Yes, I would hope we can. Anyway, we can kill the film now, because I think you get the point that these are extraordinary objects that all sit in a place where they shouldn't, and we now think that maybe we know why. We looked at the outer solar system and realized very quickly that the great red spot is located at 19.5 south. and it is rotating in this direction, counterclockwise. Well, this gave us a clue to the physics that might lie behind this so far geodetic and mathematical pattern. Because it has been called a storm, it has been called a hurricane, but in fact it is probably a deep-seated vortex extending deep into Jovian mantle of liquid hydrogen and helium. These are two color views taken during the Voyager missions. This is sort of natural color, this is exaggerated color. This thing rotates once around every 12 days. I mean, the scale of the physics that you're looking at with this vortex, and it is a vortex, are enormous. But there is a clue, because we found, much to our amazement and joy, that in the pursuit of vorticular fluid dynamics, one of the starting points and mathematical descriptions of that kind of fluid flow is tetrahedral mathematics.
This is another key place to break in for just a moment. Since the Lewis presentation, we've discovered two additional vital confirmations regarding the treasure map model of Cydonia. First, if you place a hypothetical tetrahedron in the Martian sphere, in the planet Mars, one point, one corner, will lie exactly underneath the major volcano Olympus Mons on Mars, as I described at the Lewis presentation. This major Mars energy feature lies at 19.5 degrees north latitude. The next point of the hypothetical tetrahedron on Mars lies 120 degrees east, on the exact Martian longitude of Cydonia itself. Thus, Cydonia's very placement on the planet had to be intentional, to dramatically underscore through its very existence this planetary process message. Second, one of our colleagues, David Myers in California, raised the possibility some months ago that a specific surface distance at Cydonia might measure exactly 1/360th the diameter of Mars. When Errol Torin, my colleague at Defense Mapping, and I checked Myers' suggestion, lo and behold, Myers was exactly right. The face D&M pyramid distance measures precisely 1/360th of the planetary diameter, and a second parallel measurement between the city square and the teardrop on the face, and between the D&M wedge and this same teardrop, also measures exactly 19.5 minutes of arc on the Martian planetary surface. And a minute of arc is 1/60th of a degree, which only exists in our 360-degree system of angular measurements. Needless to say, this astonishing evidence opens up the first provable possibility of a connection between an unthinkably ancient history on Earth and what took place on Mars, apparently preserved as a mathematical echo in our heretofore mysterious origins of the 360-degree system. As you will see, the basic planetary energy patterns given to us by cracking this Cydonian code allowed us to go on and successfully predict, weeks before Voyager 2 reached Neptune, what our unmanned spacecraft found before NASA actually found it. Let's continue.
Which got us to thinking, was it possible that these guys, in leaving us this message, were trying to describe vorticular fluid flow at some level? And if that was true, we then could look at other examples, for instance, at Io, which on the surface appears totally different from Jupiter, but in fact has a set of volcanoes, and when you look at the latitudes, you start out with two sets of volcanoes that straddle the equator at, you guessed it, 19 north and 19 south. There's another set that straddle the equator at 29 to 30 north and 29 to 30 south, and then another set at 45 north and 40 south. So it's beginning to look as if we have nested vortices that might, in a fluid core, be concentrating heat underneath the surface landscape we see, creating mantle plumes of material that come up and then erupt on the surface as volcanic events on planets with solid lithospheres. But the unifying physics could be vorticular fluid flow in the liquid parts of both these separate classes of worlds. Now, why does that seem to be more than just a kind of a jazzy idea? Because in the experiments that have been done in digital simulation and in analog fluid flow models in efforts to recreate the Great Red Spot, what they've discovered in the last couple of years is that when you start out with a fluid situation where there's a lot of vorticity, over time, equilibrium sets in and the little vortices coalesce into one big vortex. But we don't know, at least I have not seen in the literature, any references to where that vortex will want to live. It is our deep suspicion that whoever did Cydonia was telling us the vortex wants to live because of basic fundamental physics at 19.5 degrees north or south. Now, if this is true already, the Cydonians, and I use that term totally loosely, have told us something of pivotal, exquisite importance, because we now have a potential mechanism to unify surface phenomena on different classes of worlds and to extend the planetary science, which of course is what NASA has been doing so grandly over the last 30 years. Saturn. Saturn doesn't have any vortices. In fact, Saturn doesn't have any vorticular flow at all except for one or two high-latitude brief things that go away. They don't live very long at all. But it does have a band of clouds at about 20 north and south, or 19.5 depending upon how you tune the measurements. And those clouds appear to be upwelling, material coming up from underneath. So we began to think maybe we're looking at something which is really interesting and universal, and then we got some new data from the sun, courtesy of an experiment run at Princeton by Dr. Dickey of the Brans-Dickey alternate relativity hypothesis, who built a neat little gadget to block out the sun's light and look at the very edge to look for figure deformations due to his interpretation of relativity. And lo and behold, when you look at the surface temperature of the sun, there is a 3-degree Kelvin difference between the equator and the pole, and it peaks at about 19.5 degrees north, which also turns out to be the average latitude of sunspots. Now, the sun is a vast fluid system rotating differentially. It's beginning to look very interesting. And I would think that we should try to figure out what the physics is behind this, because the correlations were setting us up in our own minds for an interesting part of science, which is prediction. We came to all this around late June, early July of '89. We decided to put it all down on a paper, and we published it electronically on CompuServe 2 weeks before the Voyager 2 encounter. Because our feeling was, if we were onto something, there should be a vortex on Neptune, and we should be able to, using our best estimates from the Cydonia equations, predict the various parameters of the vortex before anybody knew the parameters. And it'd be fun and be hopefully some good science. So this is what we did. As Voyager got closer, it became quite obvious that there was a great dark spot, and we waited breathlessly for the latitude of the great dark spot. We had predicted it would be at 19.5 south, because we also realized very early on that there was some geomagnetic or planetomagnetic effect on the vortex, that the hemisphere in which the vortices like to live is dependent on the magnetic polarity of the planet, and we were able then to extend our prediction to include the magnetic polarity of Neptune, just for the heck of it. So we made some calls to some friends we have on the Voyager project, and as we got data, we plotted on the maps where the vortex of Neptune lives, and it turns out it was at about minus 19.5 and moving. Well, the moving part is really interesting. Can we pop up the next piece of video? Because one of the key things in our model is that these vortices are actually rising columns where energy is being fed in at the bottom and it's coming up. So they are upwellings. This is a basically supercomputer view of the spot in a frozen image rotated in the computer. This is now some time-lapse motion of some of the clouds. There were high-level methane clouds, one called the Scooter. This is the great dark spot. The real pièce de résistance is going to come up in a minute, because we predicted that the great dark spot should rotate counterclockwise, identical to Jupiter's, and be of the same proportions relative to the size of a Neptune as Jupiter's great red spot is to the size of Jupiter. And in fact, this now shows the rotation of the spot. Notice that it rotates like lumpy jelly. It doesn't have the smooth vorticity of Jupiter. It has a kind of a lopsided, incohate kind of rotation in about 16-day period. But it is rotating in the right direction, and yes, the Neptune magnetic field is of the right polarity, equivalent to Jupiter, although the angle is tipped far over.
This is the last time, I promise, I'll interrupt. But I wanted to make a couple of important points. We have at this stage in our NASA Lewis briefing identified a striking solar system-wide pattern based specifically on mathematical predictions made by decoding a set of anomalous objects at Cydonia. But we still had not identified the reason, the actual physics behind why this overwhelming pattern seems to work. All science begins by identifying patterns. Only later do scientists figure out the process. At this point, then, standing before thousands of the best engineers and scientists at NASA's major National Energy Research Facility, we suspected, but we couldn't prove yet, that this planetary Cydonia pattern was trying to tell us something absolutely fundamental about energy. Only later, at our second NASA Lewis briefing, did we have the proof that our suspicions were correct, including a profound connection between tetrahedral mathematics and grand unified field theories, which are current mainstream models of the universe that seeks to understand all fundamental forces of nature with one comprehensive mathematical theorem. We plan, as part of this NASA-Cydonia series, to release that second Lewis briefing sometime in the future. But for those who can't wait, here's a preview. We have found both a mathematical confirmation of those initial suspicions in published theoretical studies going back over 100 years, as well as some stunning laboratory demonstrations of the actual energy physics involved. In particular, in the laboratory experiments of former Harvard and MIT physicist Dr. Bruce De Palma. One of De Palma's most stunning demonstrations is a generator, the so-called N machine, which releases its energy as a direct electrical current with an output which exceeds the metered input. We now have a theoretical understanding, direct from our decoding of the Cydonia equations, with the blatant evidence before us in the solar system of how this impossible technology actually works. But for now, let us return to the initial Lewis presentation, where I'm about to outline our developing suspicions.
No one can understand why Neptune and Uranus have such radically canted magnetic fields compared to planets like Earth or Jupiter or Mercury, for instance. We think, and this is only a qualitative thought, but we think it is connected intrinsically with the formation of these vortices in the electrodynamic outer mantles, which are much closer to the surface. And in fact, if you take this electrically conductive material and rotate it around, it will have its own intrinsic magnetic field for two reasons. One having to do with its electrical conductivity, the other having to do with a gentleman named Schuster and his discovery along about the turn of the century that a magnetic field can be generated by the intrinsic rotation of a body with angular momentum. Schuster is totally unknown in the general stellar and planetary community. In our paper, we have been able to plot Schuster's predictions for all the planets and a few stars, and they fall on a beautiful straight line. If we are looking at a real physics, then what we are looking at is not just vorticity and the side effect on planetary surface features, but, and we said this in the paper, maybe an actual demonstration of a connection between gravity and electromagnetism, between angular momentum, inertia, and the electrodynamics of the Maxwell and other electromagnetic era. And if that is true, then maybe these guys were trying to tell us about something that was fundamental to the unified field theories that are currently being groped for by many, many very world-class people all around the planet right now. We wrote all this up and we ran it by a physicist in Berkeley named Saul Paul Sirag, who's published very elegant papers in Nature. And it was Saul Paul who gently informed us that the unified field theories, particularly superstring, start out based in tetrahedral mathematics. Now, what does this mean? Well, we think it means that we are on to something. We think it means that there, in fact, I should tell you that Triton, the large moon of Neptune, made of rock and water ice, has interesting volcanic calderas, not the little nitrogen spouters that they discovered, but the big, vast things that leave calderas. And the biggest one, which is up here, I can't really see the numbers, but the biggest one, which has a whole bunch of radiating flow patterns from it, is, you guessed it, at 19.5 degrees north. So this works depending on, irrespective of the substance of the world. It really is merely the vorticity of fluid flow. And you know, something just occurred to me, that you guys here at Lewis deal a lot with fluid flow. Anyway. How do you get a tiny world 300 miles across, the size of Connecticut, to have geology more splendiferous than many parts of the Earth, when it is supposed to have been nothing but a little ball of ice and died 3-4 billion years ago? Maybe, just maybe, there is an answer for this anomalous behavior to be found in the fluid dynamics associated with this place when it was not solid, but when it was liquid, and the possibility that there is a mechanism that feeds rotational energy into the internal potential energy and thereby keeps the interior liquid for a lot longer. Just a possibility, but I think worthy, again, of being explored. Well, where are we? What we have is a set of objects arrayed at a place called Cydonia, 35 million miles away at best, which in the very near future will be re-imaged by the Mars Observer spacecraft. All of my colleagues on the project agree that if we had only one photograph, if Mike Mallon really can only get us one photograph in 2 years, which I don't think is going to happen, I think we will get more, but if he can only get us one photograph, we want it of this structure. This is the so-called fort, which is the first object in the complex. It is this object right here. It faces the face. This axis goes right toward the face. The face is out there. It has such interesting incipient internal geometry at this resolution. Imagine what we will see if we get pictures 50 times sharper, as we can. It turns out getting those pictures is only a matter of targeting of the entire orbit of the spacecraft. It's all in the phasing burns, in the trim maneuvers, so that you can pass over this site looking down with the nadir pointing camera and take the photographs as you pass over this particular point on Mars. We hope that in the NASA community there will be a general interest in how we get the best photographs which will confirm or deny what we feel now is a substantial hypothesis, because if we do, we think that these photographs will show clearly to everyone's satisfaction that redundant, overwhelmingly redundant geometry is the key to solving the Cydonia question, and that geometry has been fashioned for our benefit in terms of trying to tell us something profound and important. A little further beyond unmanned missions and the return is, of course, the whole idea of men and women going to Mars. The Soviet Union, in 1984, published a provocative piece in Soviet Life called Pyramids on Mars, where Vladimir Ivinsky, who was a geologist, claimed that the Soviets, he and his colleagues, were working independently and had in fact found that these objects were important and that they had the implications that we have been discussing today, although not in terms of the numerical specificity. We have since confirmed that in fact it seems to be an independent set of observations and work, and that means, of course, that we have the beginnings of a real possibility for a joint U.S.-Soviet exploration of the implications of discovering artificial structures right next door. Well, there are more players in the game. In the last couple of months, Sierra Leone, which is a little country on the bulge of Africa, on the west coast, has issued a stamp series commemorating the coming international exploration of Mars. The souvenir sheet that they have chosen to be the pivotal linchpin in their commemoration is this. They have commemorated the face on Mars. Now, I find this very interesting for a couple of reasons. Because they are the first government to officially say, this is a problem worth knowing. And furthermore, they are commemorating a process. If we get to Cydonia with Mars Observer, and the photographs show what we now think they will show, people will look back and they'll say, how did they know, and how did they have the insight to commemorate the process of finding out before we found out? And that will reaffirm what science, to me, has always been about. It's putting yourself on the line, not in terms of claiming theories are right, but in claiming there is a way to test a theory to see if it is right. And that's all we're doing. We say now that we think the stakes are so high that we have got to tackle seriously testing the Cydonia data, because ultimately, if men and women from this planet do go to Mars, this would be the place that they would have to go to find out if, in fact, all those longings and hopes across the years of the human race not being alone can be fulfilled by simply going next door and doing what one has to do. Where did they come from? We don't know, but we can find out. It is a big galaxy, Mr. Scott, as Uhura once claimed, but starting with our nearby stellar neighborhood, it is conceivable that there could be data at Cydonia which would have been left specifically to tell us which star these visitors in our model in fact came from to leave us the very best, if I can quote a often quoted commercial. What does this have in terms of meaning for those of us on Earth who are looking at larger time horizons? If this is true, if we in fact, in terms of the solar system, were visited and left a message, the face, to me, is telling us that maybe there are some more profound connections and links that we also must consider and understand at a very significant level. Religions and philosophies have been built and have fallen on the basis of the question, who am I? The face is telling us that we may not quite be who we think we are, that we may be something more. And at this crucial point in geopolitical history, it seems appropriate that we could have the means to find out if that intimation is true. There, for instance, are great monuments on Earth that we quite haven't got a handle on yet. There are mathematical connections between the Cydonia site and the Giza Plateau, which are evident in the extensive paper. Are they real? Should we look at them more carefully? Should we re-examine some of the ancient architecture and solve some of the nagging anomalies that are quietly swept under the rug? I think that those questions are slightly premature, but not too premature to at least be considered by some of the more inquisitive minds. Okay, the message of the face. The message of the face is that we should examine the monuments of Mars. If we examine the monuments of Mars, amazing things could come true. Not the least of which is that we will find that there has been a long lineal connection with the Earth, a connection which may, in fact, portend an interesting future for the Earth. It is in our hands to find out. It is in our hands to look at our destiny right in the face and to take another walk. Thank you.
Well, now you know what NASA knows, at least to the date of the NASA Lewis taping. I have personally pursued this research for over 7 years, from a handful of inexplicable enigmas on the planet Mars to the discovery that they now embody a set of extraordinarily precise clues to an actual new energy process. This has now been verified in both the laboratory and the universe. I can only wonder what lies ahead. Our next opportunity to gain critical new information on Cydonia comes in 1993, when NASA's unmanned Mars Observer spacecraft arrives in Martian orbit. Our only guarantee, however, that we will see those Mars Observer images, in view of the last 15 years of NASA's curious behavior on the Viking Cydonia data, is through direct involvement of the political process. Practically, that means Congress, our elected representatives in Washington, who, on our behalf, fund NASA. One of those congressional representatives, who has already seen our data and was obviously impressed, was the courageous former chairman of the House Science Committee, Robert Rowe. Congressman Rowe, after a personal briefing, stated his position very clearly. I have seen the studies and I have seen the photos, and there do appear to be formations of a face, as well as pyramids, that do not appear to be of natural or normal existence. It looked like they had to be fashioned by some intelligent beings. Chairman Rowe inexplicably resigned in 1991. The new chairman of this critical committee, the Honorable George E. Brown, has not, as far as we know, directly seen these studies. He will if you take the time to write your individual representative or senator regarding what you have seen on this official NASA briefing. And if you voice the urgent need that Cydonia be rephotographed in 1993 and that those pictures be immediately made public. You may also write to Chairman Brown directly. Chairman George E. Brown, House Committee on Science, Space, and Technology, Suite 2321, Rayburn Office Building, Washington, D.C., 20515. Going back to Cydonia and finding out what else we can discover, appropriately now, is in your hands. What we find out and what we do about it ultimately depends on you. This is Richard Hoagland.
The music you have heard during the introduction of this program and under the flyover of the Cydonia Region of Mars was created by Mark Twain and is excerpted from The Monuments of Mars, the music. It's available from Backroads Distributors.